Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new malicious compliance stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
The first story is titled Be the Worst Neighbors Ever? Okay, we will too. I grew up on a horse ranch in Colorado. We had a long piece of property, about 80 acres, and we raised Missouri fox trotters. We had lived there for almost 20 years when some folks bought a strip of property way at the back of our land. It was a strange plot of land as it was very narrow, and was sandwiched between our back fence and a busy county road. We were surprised anyone would buy it actually, as it forced the house to be pretty close to said road. Well, we never meet these new neighbors until one day, my dad gets a notice from a lawyer telling us that after having surveyed the property lines, our back fence encroaches on their property between 3 and 6 inches depending on the spot along the fence line. These folks had never met us, never introduced themselves. Our first introduction was this legal demand. My father was a salt of the earth kind of man, very kind, but also very strong-willed. He called these folks, arranged a meet-up, and tried to talk some sense into them. First, did 3 to 6 inches really matter that much? And why had they not come to us to talk it through? He even offered a number of different compromises. These folks were hostile from the get-go. They demanded he move the fence immediately, or they would sue. Apparently, the law stated they had to put their house so far away from our fence line, and they wanted to push it as far back from the road as they could when they built it. So they wanted that 6 inches very badly. I still remember when my dad got home from the meeting. He hung his hat up and shook his head when he told my mum in his slow way, "Well, looks like we got the kind of folks for neighbors you don't ever want to have for neighbors." They sued and won, and we were forced to move the fence in 2 weeks. I say we because I was the free slave labor as all farm kids are for this kind of thing. All that fencing material, and the time were a big cost for my family. But we got the work done that late fall. Here is where the fun comes in. So the new neighbors broke ground and built all through the end of winter and into spring. The very next weekend after they had moved into their house, Dad rousted me out of bed and we took the big truck into town to the lumber yard. I was extremely puzzled as we loaded up a bunch of fencing material and building supplies. We didn't have any big projects going that I knew about, and I kept asking him what it was for, but he just told me to wait and see with a devilish smile on his face. We built a pen and a small enclosure very near our back property line, directly behind the neighbor's new shiny house. The next day one of our farm friends delivered a half-dozen pigs to their new home. Dad insisted on feeding those hogs table scraps and all the things that would go in the composter, as well as some well-balanced hog feed to keep them healthy. Now you may not know this, but the smell of pig excrement is directly related to what they eat and their pen conditions. Table scraps make them smell bad. I mean bad. I had to drive the four-wheeler back there every day to take care of them. And within a month halfway to the pen and my eyes would start watering, it smelled so bad. When we mucked out the pen with the bobcat, we also made the pile right next to the pen. I can't even imagine how bad the smell was living in that house. The neighbors, of course, freaked out and again without ever even trying to talk to us, went the legal route. They lost the case asking to have the pen removed as the area was zoned agricultural. And my dad had done his homework to make sure he was not breaking any laws or regulations. The pigs were far enough from us and our other neighbors that it didn't bother anyone but the people he wanted it to bother. Come fall, when winter moved in, we sold the pigs to slaughter. And Dad stacked up a bunch of building supplies next to the pen and let the neighbors know we would be expanding the profitable operation in the spring. He smiled the whole time, speaking in his slow, steady way as they screamed at him. The new neighbors sold their new house in January when the ground was frozen and the new owners would not smell the pen. Though as soon as the old neighbors were gone, we tore down the enclosure, spread the nasty stuff on the hayfield, and the new neighbors never had any bad smell come spring. They also were great neighbors and are still lifelong friends. Never mess with a rancher. Here's a little more context. My dad really did want to try to cultivate a good relationship with a new neighbor. even though they started on such a lousy foot. He offered to sell them 5 acres of land at the back of the property at a super affordable price so they could have a better plot and get well back from the road. Our back fence line was almost 5 acres long, so it would have shaved an acre-long line off is all. And that was wooded land that was not good pasture land anyway. They were not interested. They had plenty of funds too, by the way, as they were sitting on $1 million payout from selling their home in CA, which we knew as they brought it up multiple times in the discussion. Statements that they had all the money they needed to take us to court if we didn't comply immediately. My dad asked if he could move the fence over time, rather than being hit for the cost all at once. Ranches are not made of money. We could move the section right behind the proposed building site immediately to help with planning etc. first. They were not willing to do that. It all had to be moved immediately. Lastly, my dad was friends with the 2 guys that did the inspections for the county for this kind of stuff. We had built many additions and changed on the ranch over time as well. They were all in the volunteer fire department together as well. He offered to get all of them together and see what options they had for dealing with the offset issue. The neighbor refused, again demanding the fence be moved immediately. If you see a theme here, so did my dad. There is no pleasing some people, so my dad let him take us to court. I later found out Dad was using the time to save up some money since he figured he would have to move the fence and that was expensive. And he hoped maybe the neighbor would not push it that far and come to work with him rather than go to all that cost. I know my dad reached out a couple more times to the neighbor before things went to court too. The next story is titled "Ex-Landlord Says He'll See Me in Court." I take him to court instead and win. Brief backstory: a couple years ago, I was in an apartment with my friend and younger sister. My sister was violent towards my friend and I ended up having to get a restraining order against her. She brought in a dog without permission, which caused some damage to the unit. I informed my landlord of the incidences of violence and the damage and sent him pictures. He basically told me to deal with it myself, which I did by getting the protective order. After this, my roommate questioned the legality of holding us responsible for her portion of rent. I told her it was. But she asked our landlord for a copy of the lease to show her uncle anyway, which admittedly was pretty stupid. Up until this point, our landlord had not asked us to leave due to my sister's actions. But he did after the lease was brought into it. We were out by the date he specified on the notice to quit, the first step in the eviction process before the eviction actually occurs. My roommate was there until midnight making sure the place was spotless. We moved to an apartment across the street. 2 weeks had passed since he was informed that we had vacated the unit. And we had not gotten anything regarding our security deposit. In our state, a landlord is required by law to either return the remainder of a security deposit within 2 weeks, or provide a letter itemizing what the deposit was used for. If they don't, the tenant is owed the entire deposit. If the withholding is willful, the tenant is owed double the original deposit. The landlord had actually told me that he would be going on vacation immediately after we vacated. So I returned our keys to him and waited to see if he would send anything. He never did. After consulting with a tenants' rights group to be sure I was in the right, I sent a pre-formatted letter 16 days after we vacated, which stated the specific laws regarding security deposits, and gave him our current address to send either the deposit or receipt to. The day after I sent this letter, I see him across the street, frantically running into the apartment for the first time since we moved out. I receive a text from him saying that he would return what's left of our deposit if he could get the apartment rented by the 1st of next month. I respond by telling him that, as the letter I sent explained, he forfeits the right to keep any of the deposit after the 2 weeks is up. He responded saying that he would see us in court and that we were nightmare tenants, and that this will be fun. He said he would also be taking us to court for the costs to relist and rent the apartment, which he claimed exceeded the amount of our deposit. After about a month or 2 of hearing nothing back, we decided to say duck it and file a small claims suit against him, as he clearly wasn't going to follow through on his threats. As the person who had almost all communication with him, I was the plaintiff in the case. He brought a letter that was dated for the day he texted me, where he arbitrarily wrote in what he used the deposit on, and claimed he sent us the letter. That obviously didn't add up, which I thoroughly explained to the judge, as he had texted me that day saying that we would get some of the deposit returned, and that he had no proof that he actually sent that letter. He clearly just wrote it and printed it out for the court hearing. During the court hearing, he also said a lot of false and victim-blaming crap, such as implying that I participated in the violence that occurred, saying we caused damages that were definitely there when we moved in, and just attacking my character in general. The judge ruled that the withholding of the security deposit was willful and awarded us double the deposit. But of course that wasn't the end of it, and a few days before his deadline to pay us the money, he sends me a text just letting me know that the decision has been appealed. I didn't answer and showed up to court again. And lo and behold, it's more mudslinging and arguing about things that we already established in the first hearing. The judge upheld the original decision, and he eventually mailed me the check for double the deposit. In the memo line on the check where you can write the reason for the payment, he wrote, "For gaining £20. But hey, I cashed that check and spent my half on a new gaming laptop. So I'd say I got the last laugh." I desperately wanted to text him and ask him if it was as fun as he thought it would be, but resisted the urge. The next story is titled, "On My Microphone and Camera." Sure. So some background info: I take around 1 hour to reach home from school, and I join some club which has some weird rules, but that's not important to the story today. On to the story. So my teacher released us late from school, and I had around 15 minutes to get home in order to join the online call. Yes, we have school but no meeting in my country. Weird. I texted the organizers about me having to be late, and we came to the agreement that I would join the call as I walked home. When I joined the call, I immediately heard the organizers say, "On your camera." Fine. Part 1 of Malicious Compliance complete. I turned on my camera and allowed the entire call to see the beautiful sky, followed by raindrops slowly falling down. But that wasn't even the funniest part. So moving on, I got on the public transport. It's a train, which, disclaimer, has really loud announcements and sounds and background noises essentially. For some reason the organizers believed it was an amazing idea to ask someone who is on their way home to turn on their microphone on public transport. Cue malicious compliance. I turned on my microphone and walked closer to the speaker things inside the train, letting the beautiful noises blast into the call and interrupt whoever was speaking. According to one of my friends who were already in the call, almost nothing could be heard by the rest of the people in the call, other than that next stop. Quote, "The organizers ended up having me turn off my mic, and yes, that's my malicious compliance. Not as havoc-wreaking as many others in this sub. But hey, it was satisfying." The next story is titled, "Hours Will Be Counted." I worked as a contract graphic designer for a large Canadian retailer that has a big cat as their logo. I had the habit of staying later to finish projects, but only charged for regular 9 to 5. As such, the supervisor and I had an unwritten agreement that I could show up a little late from time to time, since I always got the work done on time. One day, I'm coming in 25 minutes after 9 and the head of HR runs into me in the hallway. She asks if I'm just arriving to work. I tell her yes, and she immediately escorts me to the supervisor's office to rat me out. The supervisor tries to explain our agreement, but the HR manager tells me that if it happens again my contract will be terminated. From that day forward I started counting all my overtime and billing them for it. When asked why I was suddenly billing at a higher rate by management, I explained to them what had happened. A few weeks later I was offered a better job elsewhere, and decided I would show up late the next day. The HR manager saw me get there late and started stomping over as she arrived. I handed her my resignation letter and walked out. I found out later that they ended up needing to hire 2 designers to keep up with the pace that I was keeping on my own. The next story is titled, "Knock My Parenting." And I'll sit beside you with my fussy twins. I was at the doctor's office today and had to bring my 15-month-old twins with me. These kiddos do not enjoy being cooped up in a stroller, but letting them wander around isn't an option since they will both bolt in opposite directions immediately. They have clean nappies. They've been fed and hydrated. So at this point, any fussing is just stroller-related crankiness. In preparation for having to wait a while and wanting to be considerate of the others who were in waiting room purgatory with me, I packed the diaper bag full of endless snacks and sippy cups. Sure enough, 5 minutes in they lose their mind, so I instantly start giving them snacks and also walking back and forth in the very large waiting room. I am at the back area and not even close to being in anyone's way, and as long as I am pacing, the beasties will quietly munch away on their Cheerios. At one point, I stopped pacing to hear the doctor mumble the next patient's name in another barely audible whisper, and this is where a cranky old lady decides to weigh in on my parenting. I hear a huffing noise and look over at her, and the second we make eye contact she says, "Oh my God. You have got to stop walking up and down that back area. You're making me dizzy. Also, you really shouldn't be feeding them that much. Just sit down and they will relax too. Watching toddlers really shouldn't be that hard, hun. Thanks." Firstly, while my girls are very healthy, they were preemies born at 3 pounds, 1.5 kilograms and are still very tiny, so I will feed them all the damn Cheerios I want. Secondly, I am doing all this not for myself or the twins but for the benefit of all those around us. Finally, I was waiting to find out if my scans showed cancer or not. Hooray, scans were clean, so I really didn't care. Now for the malicious compliance. I take her advice and sit down right next to her. Tons of empty seats everywhere, by the way. Instantly, they start screaming their heads off, and what do? I pull out my book and start reading. Anyone who has ever been seated next to a stranger's baby having a meltdown. Close your eyes. Imagine that crappy moment and now double it to account for twins. Within 5 minutes she is looking like she is about to snap and suggests they might want a snack. To which I calmly respond, "Nah. I really shouldn't be feeding them that much," and coolly turn the page of my book. 10 minutes later, my name is finally called and this lady looks like she is ready to give up on life. I, however, have read my first chapter in ages. I guess watching toddlers really isn't that hard after all. The next story is titled "Bill Me Hundreds of Dollars for What I Already Know?" Here's my weekly payment. Years ago on Memorial Day long weekend, I was enjoying a tasty frozen Snickers bar and broke a tooth. Being a holiday weekend, I knew the dentist office would be closed but thought maybe they had some sort of nurse line or something for advice. Imagine my surprise when I received an answer and was transferred to my usual dentist. After answering numerous questions, including whether or not the tooth had broken above or below the gum line, important for later, the dentist says he'd be happy to see me in the morning, Memorial Day itself. So I go in. His office is void of any humans besides himself. There were some fish to bear witness. He puts on one latex glove, takes a look in my mouth and says, "Oh, it's below the gum line. We discussed this. You're going to have to go to a maxillofacial surgeon. I've got a guy the first can refer you to, but he's not open until tomorrow." He refuses to do anything further in his office, not even a painkiller script. The bastard, and I leave. I get it fixed the next day and was relatively happy with the surgery. Imagine my surprise when a few weeks later I get a bill from the dentist for $700. I call the office and they explain that it was an emergency service on a holiday I was being billed for. After arguing with them that this never came up once on the phone or during the visit and all he did was put on one glove, look in my mouth and tell me he couldn't do anything, they wouldn't budge on the bill. Being the total vindictive idiot that I am, I said fine, but I'm broke and I also had a surgery bill to pay, so I'd be paying it out with weekly $5 payments. They didn't necessarily like this and tried to get a higher monthly payment, but I wasn't budging either. So, I started sending them $5 a week along with a single latex glove, which they returned each with a note saying it wasn't a large enough payment. After a few months of this, the bill went to collections. Let me tell you folks, I kept every single return check and explained to the collection agency that I'd been trying to send them money for months but they refused my payment. I sent them my proof with the return checks and notes from the dentist. It was a beautiful moment when the agency informed me that I'd done my part by attempting payments. It disappeared off my credit report shortly afterward, and that's the last I ever heard of the matter. The next story is titled "Won't Let My Kid Through Without a Passport?" Here, take him. This story was passed down to me by my dad about what his dad did when my dad was little. My grandfather was in the military and was stationed in Germany with his family. They lived there for a few years, and during that time, my grandmother got pregnant and had my dad. When his deployment was over and he returned home, my dad didn't have a passport yet, but he had the proper documentation. A citizenship certificate, birth certificate, and letters from his commanding officer, the base doctor, and delivery doctor. When he was passing through customs, even with the proper documentation, the agent wouldn't clear my dad because he didn't have a passport. My grandfather was a drill sergeant. I don't know if he was before or after this incident, and could yell and argue with the best of them, so he and the agent heatedly went back and forth for a while. All the while my grandmother stood behind him, embarrassed of the attention the commotion was causing, holding my 2-year-old dad up with one arm and my aunt's hand with her other hand. At one point the agent yelled at my grandfather something along the lines, "I don't care what you think you know. You're not bringing that kid in here." To which my grandfather only said okay, turned to my grandmother, ripped always the wording when told to me, my dad out of her hands, placed him on the agent's counter, and took my grandmother's and aunt's hand and started briskly walking away. The poor man realized my grandfather was serious. No one knew how far my grandfather would have gone to prove his point, and begged and pleaded for him to come back. My grandfather did come back after a minute and took my dad and his stamped papers without saying a word and left. The agent didn't say anything after that either. The next story is titled Motel Adventures in Beautiful Hawaii. So, I'm poor. I worked on a cruise ship around Hawaii for a while. For the uninitiated, cruise ship staff works 7 days a week, and the restaurant staff almost never gets evenings off, for obvious reasons. Now and then, we'd get a Thursday night off, because that night in port, folks would usually go to a luau, leaving the ship in need of less staffing. Lots of us went out drinking that night. With caveats, we had to rotate because there were only so many that could leave the ship. Also, you can't get back on the ship with a BAC of over 0.04. Per Coast Guard regulations. I felt that the best way to satisfy my needs would be getting an overnight hotel, and leaving for my breakfast shift the next morning. A local motel owner always helped me out and accepted only cash as payment. Well, one of those much-needed evenings off, my usual place was filled up, so I discovered another. The place was almost twice the price. But hey, I needed it. Any touristy places would have been outrageously marked up, this being Hawaii and all. So I went in to pay with cash. We don't accept cash. Okay, can I use my Bluebird Amex? Told you I was poor. We only accept Visa or MasterCard. Can I give you cash and my Amex info as insurance? Nope. Visa or MasterCard only. So just then I remembered. Hey, I found the place on Expedia. Why not use it? So I booked a room on Expedia, which accepts Amex, and was charged even less than I would have paid for a room because apparently there were discounts worked out for the website. Came back in. Receptionist didn't seem happy, but to be fair, she wasn't terribly happy for any of the time I spoke with her. I hope they enjoyed that Expedia service charge and discount. I left at 5 a.m. the next morning, as usual. Probably the easiest money they ever made. Except they got less of it. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel and post some bear emojis in the comment.